Cairo, Seattle.
It's time to get schooled with the professor, John Clayton.
Welcome to Schooled with the Professor. And I'll tell you what, sometimes, you never know what's going to happen when you're in the Pro Football Hall of Fame voting and all that stuff. And, you get impassioned pleas and stuff like that. And there's so many players that deserve to get in, so sometimes don't get into the room. We get into the room, of course, every year, the day before the Super Bowl, and talk about the 15 people that are in. And we're so pleased to be joined by Everson Walls, who was able to make it. And I guess the good and bad news is, this is the last year for eligibility for the Hall of Fame, but of course you can become a senior candidate, and if you don't make it this year, you can make it next year. But Everson Walls, cornerback for the Dallas Cowboys, he played for New York Giants, Cleveland Browns, 14 years. You'll love the tack that I'm going to take with you in a couple minutes. But first off, congratulations on being in the 15 for the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Man, John, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you guys' support, and I must say it's unusual to hear how open the process is now. At one point, this was like one of the, best kept secrets in sports. And now it seems like everyone is aware of the process and everything that the potential Hall of Famers have to go through. The like you said, the passionate pleas that are laid down on some of our players' behalf it's pretty cool that people are finally getting almost a front row view of what's going on and how this process works.
Yeah, and of course, it keeps getting more enhanced every year because, now with, more programming that's around the Hall of Fame, more documentary type stuff that comes out. Now it gets to the point where you have Dave Baker, who runs the Hall of Fame, going to the door of a hotel room door, knocking on the door, and then saying the congratulations after the vote comes in. And so that's there. And of course, all the specials and all that stuff. I know that NFL Network had a special on Tuesday when they announced the voting and the result of the top, taking it down from 27 to 15. And of course, we're happy that you were able to make it. I want to kind of go over your career in the cornerback position. And this one may sound a little unusual to you. Do you kind of realize, and you probably do, that you may have been, 3 decades ahead of your time, the way you played the cornerback position? And the reason I say
hey, I could brag and say, yes, of course, John, I knew that. I was ahead of my time. I'm a trailblazer. No, it's so funny that after being with a generation, it wasn't, obviously just me, but a generation of players, of course, before me, there was the Mel Blunts and the Lim Barneys. You had Dick LeBeau. Guys getting numbers. They're putting up numbers. I'm talking about cornerbacks, right? Putting up numbers. And if you recall, Ronnie Lott played cornerback his first year. He had a decent year his first year. So we were just, I don't know. It was just a mindset, John, that I really don't know where that mindset went, because we as players, when we grew up, we played everything. We played every position we could play, whatever, basketball, football, soccer, baseball. And we took all of those, whatever mental acuity you had for that particular sport, you put it into the other sports, and it made you a more complete player. I think these guys now, I think they're just so pigeonholed from the minute they start playing ball, like, you're going to be a defensive back, you're going to be a cornerback, and that's all you're going to do. And you're going to learn to backpedal. You're going to learn to knock the ball down. That has to be the way it is, because I know when I first came and started playing ball my senior year at Berkman High School in Richardson, I came from the basketball court. And when they tell you to get the ball at its highest point, that was always ingrained in my mind. That's what the coach went over every day, over and over again. We did the ball drills. We went up for the rebounds and things. So now when the ball's up in the air, whether it's football, baseball, or whatever, I don't care. I think it belongs to me, and just like the wide receiver thinks it belongs to him. And I think the DBs nowadays are so just content with just either letting them catch it, period, and knocking them down, or just finally just knocking the ball down. And I've said it before. I couldn't be a defensive back coach and look at myself in the mirror if my cornerbacks and my DBs are not getting multiple interceptions each year. I mean, multiple interceptions. And it just doesn't seem like it's a lost art. It is extremely confusing for me, and it's tough to watch on TV, John. Extremely tough to watch.
But I'll tell you, here's where I think, because there's a comparable I'm going to bring up and see if it kind of fits, okay? Because, I know when I was talking to your longtime agent, Steve Weinberg, and we're talking about the Hall of Fame, and I said, the one thing I knew about Everson, he was one of the smartest cornerbacks I've ever been around. He also knew every little nuance of the position to take advantage because, being an undrafted cornerback usually says one thing, may not have the best speed. But the smarts can make up for it. And the mannerisms that you use, the technique that you use, and the guy that I bring up, and this is why I say maybe 3 decades ahead of your time, is Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman didn't have the speed. I mean, he wasn't the fastest guy, but the technique that he uses. Now, you were 6'1", he's 6'3", but you had the angular arms and all that stuff. You were able to use your hands to position them to make sure that you can cover and man and all that stuff. And that's why it's like the Everson Walls that played for 14 years fits perfectly right now.
I would have to agree with that. You got back in '81, we were run first, John. Everything was Tony Dorsett, Walter Payton. All you had was runners. You guys like Ward Dunn. Every running back on your team had to be the runner. He had to be that guy. Quarterbacks were not the necessary stars of the team at that time. They weren't the catalysts as much as you had the Riggins, as much as you had the Taylors and those type of running backs. So when you look at it now, balls are flying around all over the field, and I'm just so confused as to why they just end up in the wide receiver's hands with no problem. And I just have to believe that a guy like Richard Sherman, that reincarnation that you want to call it, he that's why he was able to get those numbers. And every time he got his numbers, every time they were raised, they would always put the comparison between myself and him. They didn't know my numbers were always a little bit higher. And you're right. A guy like Richard Sherman plays just like me. We talked the other day. They said, "Who would you compare yourself to?" This is just me and a couple of buddies talking. And at first I said, Aqib Talib. He went to my school at Bergen High School in Richardson, around the same size, very aggressive when it comes to playing the ball. I think he's a little more physical than I am, definitely. But Richard Sherman was the guy that we came to that final conclusion. Because as you said, when you're running down the field, I'm not trying to race a wide receiver. I'm competing with him step for step as we go down the field. So I'm not going to give him any room. I'm not going to give him any room to have a free stride if I can help it. And we would do things like people now talk about the arm bar, as they call it. An arm bar is stiff. If you're a defensive back and you don't want to be called for that, then you have to do the arm bar while you're in a running motion. You have to continue to move both arms. And that's the way that I always try to conceal my subtle contact with the wide receiver. It slows him down, number one, and number two, he takes the concentration from his hands to the ball to my hands and his hands interacting. So there's a distraction there, just briefly, to where I can take his concentration off the ball while mine remains on the ball. And it kind of levels the playing field just a little bit between the DB and the wide receiver.
Yeah, and that's the one thing, because I know, and it also seems that there was an awareness you had, particularly in covering an intermediate pass or a long pass, a fade or that, when you're covering the defensive back. I mean, you seem to have always a sense of where the official was to make sure that as much as you were using your arms and all that stuff, that you weren't going to get that penalty. Now, of course, all receivers are going to complain about everything, but you seem to be able to master that in not being able to pick up those holding penalties or the interferences.
Don't you hate those little diva wide receivers, man?
Listen, I'll tell you this. Over the past couple of years, for the first time in my career, I've been doing some sideline stuff on radio, and I'm amazed at what I see from the wide receivers. I mean, in the Houston-Seattle game, DeAndre Hopkins, the wide receiver, I think he had like about 224 yards of receiving. Every time that, he would be mostly catching from the left side. Every time they threw to the right, I mean, he was either raising his arms in question mark stance. It's like, what? Why not over here? But yeah, I mean, I watched Sammy Watkins of the Rams pass me like 5 times complaining about, doing deep routes as decoys and not getting the ball. So yeah, you're right about that.
They are such divas, man. So, I just always enjoyed turning the tables. Wide receivers and offensive coordinators are the bane of my existence because they think every pass and every passing play is supposed to work. It's like we're just chess pieces out there waiting to be moved. No, we're human beings, man. Dennis Thurman, Thurman Steves, that's what we called ourselves back in the day when I was playing. Dennis Thurman from USC, he said, and he would say this to the coaches all the time in the meeting room, well, how'd you let that guy catch that pass? And Dennis would say, Coach, these guys get paid too, And I thought that was just so poignant because just like he thinks his play is supposed to work, then I think mine is supposed to work. So it's a matter of will. It's not just that I'm going to win every play. This guy gets paid too. So let's always take that into consideration. But I think the thing that really helped me more than anything, and you talked about the intermediate routes and the long passes, I had eventually I knew I had to turn my head around. Okay, that's the only way I'm going to see the ball, and I think that's something that they've been taught to the contrary by defensive coaches. The defensive backs now rarely turn around. And I know, man, you don't have to be a football player, John, to think, you know what, if that guy would have just turned his head around, that ball would have hit him right in his face. Okay? So you can't, when you start running deep with the wide receiver, there is a fear that can paralyze you if you're not careful. And that is the fear of getting beat. So you have to, I never succumb to that fear. It's in everyone's head. But you can't succumb to that fear. I think your greed, has to overcome the fear because your greed needs to be, I want that ball. I cannot wait for them to throw that ball. I hope it's in the air right now because I'm about to turn around and pick it off. So your greed has to overcome your fear of getting beat. And when you have that fear, it does some things to you. Your legs and your arms stop moving at the same time. You can't think, and your arms and legs move at the same time, and you tend to freeze up. Even though you're still moving down the field, mentally you freeze up. And that's something that every DB has to fight against.
Take us through a little history lesson here. Now, I go back into the 70s, and I covered the Steelers, and I watched the transformation. I watched Mel Blount, Mike Haynes, all those guys. And one of the things that was there before 1978 was the ability to just smash a wide receiver at the line of scrimmage. And so they changed the rule. So that was 1978. I mean, they could just mug receivers at the line of scrimmage and do as much as they want. Well, they changed that. So, yeah, you come in 4 years later in 1981. What was it like watching that transition? Because I'm sure that you watched it from college and seeing what could have been done by a defensive back. Now you can't do it. So what was the style mostly in 1981 and thereafter as far as coverage?
You talk about the ability to beat a receiver up, which, those are definitely fun times. And now you had to go from a more physical cornerback to a cornerback more like myself who has to have the ability to backpedal fluidly, not just backpedal, but you have to keep your backpedal alive. So now you've got more nimble cornerbacks. Mel Blount and Lim Barney and those guys, of course, they're nimble and they're very athletic. And Mel Blount, 6'5" cornerback, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. But Lim Barney was extremely agile. He's a punt returner, so he had all the things that a Mel Renfro had as well. Those guys were nimble, but they did not really need the back pedal as much as you needed it post rule change. So now we've got to stay off of them a little bit less contact. And that was always good for me because I wasn't too crazy about getting up in the wide receiver's face. If I miss him with my lack of speed, he's gone. So I liked having that 5 to 7 yard cushion to where when the closer he gets to me, the more I can anticipate what his route's going to be. I have to tell you a funny story. I saw Mark Duper at a Bayou Classic event. He's from Louisiana. You know, I went to Grambling State University. Ricky Jackson was there as well, you know, New Orleans Saints, Hall of Fame linebacker. And it was all a Louisiana thing at this Bayou Classic. And Duper saw me walk into the room. He was already seated. And when he looked at me, he had this scowl on his face. And the words he said to me were, "I could never turn you." Those are the first words. He didn't even speak first. He just looked at me and said, "I could never turn you." And that's the success you want to hear from a defense, from a wide receiver. Because if you can stay in your back pedal longer than the wide receiver has to make his move, then he has committed before he wants to. Because his whole thing is he wants to see you come out of that back pedal and turn that hip. Okay, he wants to see you turn that hip. And when you turn that hip, he's going to plant his foot and go the other way. So I was able to maintain my back pedal enough to where the wide receiver eventually had to commit first. So I've always been proud of my back pedal. It's something that people really, it's a lost art as well. I think it's something that could really help these wide receivers. But once again, we're in a whole new era of sports to where it's just a long forgotten process now.
Also, going back in history, talk about because again, as a smart player, I'm sure you're aware of the change, but when Jimmie Johnson came in, he brought from the University of Miami, he brought in a 4-3 that, was quick on the defensive line, man-to-man type stuff with the cornerbacks and that. How did that change the game? And Jimmie Johnson and the Cowboys, the teams that you played on?
We were accustomed to, with the Cowboys, we were accustomed to a flex defense. That was something that Tom Landry invented himself to control the explosiveness of Jim Brown. You had, I can't remember his linebacker's name now, but I think it was Huff. Mm-hmm. Huff was one of the better linebackers in the league, but with the New York Giants, they could do nothing with Jim Brown. So Tom Landry came up with this coordinated defense, especially with the front seven linebackers and linemen. So no matter how good your D lineman was, he cannot go all out. He has to maintain a coordinated fit for the linebacker, the middle linebacker, to make the play. So you've got guys at times, you had what we call the doomsday defense. Now that doomsday defensive line, as great as they were, they could have been a little bit better because Tom Landry's defense really holds them back because we want to play run first. We don't play pass in certain situations when this flex defense is called. So now you change that to where you've got Ed Jones and Randy White and Harvey Martin. They're waiting on the line for, this coordinated process to take place. Now here comes Jimmy with these guys, man. They had Leon Lett. They've got Charles Haley. They've got these most dynamic, athletic defensive linemen, and they are penetrating. Okay, they are moving that offensive line backwards. That's the opposite of what the flex was doing. So now you've got chaos all up front, uncontrolled chaos all up front with Jimmy's guys, and the defensive backs are taking advantage of that. So you've got people flying around all over the field, knocking people out, making plays. And that's totally different from the more coordinated and controlled scheme of the flex defense.
And of course, and that transition was after the Bill Walsh came in and basically turned the receiver position almost into basketball type of plays with all the crossing routes and everything else.
Offense, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's great.
When we had to deal, that was something that was totally new for us in regards to that West Coast offense. I had seen San Diego and Cornell and Coryell and how he had the Chargers playing with Dan Fouts. I'd actually played against them in a preseason game, but it was something about the way Joe and Bill Walsh were doing it. You really, everything was about timing, as you say. It's like going against a Popovich basketball, half court offense, because everything is about timing. The ball is always moving, no matter what. You couldn't mentally or physically catch your breath, while you're trying to get accustomed to this pace. And of course, that was a great counter against the flex defensive line, because while we sit back and wait, they're steady attacking. And I remember the first time we played against that particular team in '81, that was way before the playoff game. That was early in the year before the playoff game, the championship game. They blew us out. I think they blew us out like 45-17 or some crap like that. And Joe toasted me all over the field. I was leading the league before we played that game, and by the time I came out of that game, I felt like I didn't even know what a football was anymore. My head was still spinning on the way home on the plane. And so when we played them in the championship game, everything was different. We had gotten accustomed to it. But that's something that you have to prepare for, because that style, it can really take you for a loop if you're not ready.
Everson, I think it's so great talking to you, but what's even more important is talking about you when we get into the room for the Pro Football Hall of Fame the day before the Super Bowl. I wish you the best of luck, and thanks for joining us.
I appreciate it, John. Hey, man, get up there like a Baptist preacher, man, okay?
Yes.
Get up there.
Sing the praises.
Yeah. I want you to sweat. I want you to, you got to have a handkerchief and everything, man.
Give me some music. I need some music behind me to get that going.
Yeah, you need some of that good Baptist music, gospel music, man. That's what you need, man. I appreciate you, brother.
Okay. Hey, Everson, thank you. That does it for this week's podcast. In between episodes, you can follow me on Twitter at ClaytonESPN. If you enjoy these weekly one-on-one conversations, consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time on Schooled with the Professor.